The town of Elmridge had always been quiet, tucked away between rolling hills and expansive farmland. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, where neighbors exchanged recipes over the garden fence, and the evenings were filled with the distant sound of children's laughter as they ran home at sunset. Life in Elmridge was predictable, peaceful, and safe. But all of that changed one summer when a trio of stray dogs appeared out of nowhere. It started with sightings here and there. First, a farmer reported seeing a large black dog rooting through his trashed cans late one night. The next morning, an elderly couple was startled when a sandy-colored dog dashed past their porch, growling at their small dog. Then, the most alarming incident. A group of kids walking home from school had a close call with a snarling, aggressive dog. One of the children, Billy Thompson, had barely escaped when the dog lunged at him. He was shaken, but the only thing that saved him was the quick thinking of his older sister, Sarah, who had thrown a rock, causing the dog to run off. People tried to ignore it at first. After all, strays came and went all the time. But something felt different about these three. They didn't just wander aimlessly like the usual strays. They were a pack, always together, and always near the edge of town, watching and waiting. By the time the third incident occurred, the dogs had stopped being a curiosity. They were a menace. The first attack came one warm Saturday afternoon. A jogger named Jeff, who was new to the area, was running along the main road when the black dog appeared. It was bigger than he had imagined, with sharp, bared teeth and a deep growl that echoed through the quiet street. The dog lunged at Jeff, who barely managed to avoid the bite, but not without falling into a thorn bush, leaving him with cuts and bruises. Word spread quickly. The jogger's injuries were minor, but the fear it sparked was not. Soon, the town became divided. People who had once felt safe were now locking their doors earlier in the evening. The local cafe, which had always been filled with the hum of chatter, became eerily quiet. No one wanted to risk being outside. Strangers in town had no idea what to expect, and even the longtime residents were on edge. Dog sightings increased, and whispers of attacks and near misses echoed down every street. The town's concern grew to panic when the dogs began wandering closer to homes. The once vibrant park became deserted. No children play on the swings anymore. Instead, they watched through their windows as the trio of dogs patrolled the neighborhood like silent sentinels. No one knew where they had come from, but everyone feared what might happen if they stayed. Despite several attempts by animal control, the dogs always slipped away, disappearing into the trees or fields. They were elusive, smarter than anyone had expected, and with each failed attempt to catch them, the dogs seemed to grow bolder, as if they knew they were untouchable. What had started as a strange nuisance was quickly becoming a full-blown crisis. The town, once a picture of calm, was now a place of suspicion, fear, and uncertainty. It was in this climate of fear that Mia, a quiet, thoughtful 9-year-old girl, began to see things differently. While the adults saw monsters in the dogs, Mia saw something else. Fear. It wasn't obvious to anyone else, but Mia wasn't like most kids. She had always had an affinity for animals, a deep understanding of their behavior, even when others couldn't. Mia believed these dogs weren't the threat the town thought they were, but convincing others would be a different challenge entirely. As the days passed, fear took a firm grip on Elmridge. What began as a few isolated incidents had now escalated into a full-scale crisis. The town, once filled with the hum of busy shops and the cheerful sounds of children playing, had become eerily quiet. People locked themselves inside their homes at dusk, and the once bustling streets now stood empty, save for the occasional passing car or the haunting silhouette of the stray dogs prowling the edges of town. The first few sightings had been shrugged off as accidents, but as the dogs' aggression increased, so did the town's fear. The dogs weren't just threatening. They were organized, as if they were working together to drive people out of their own streets. The black dog, the largest of the three, was often seen standing guard, his intense gaze scanning the horizon. The sandy-colored dog was fast and erratic, darting through yards and alleys, while the smallest, a scruffy mutt, often circled back, barking wildly and keeping everyone on edge. The tipping point came one night when the dogs attacked a delivery van. It was late, and the driver, a local named Gary, had just finished his route. As he drove through one of the quieter neighborhoods, the black dog suddenly appeared in the headlights, growling and darting in front of the van. The driver slammed on the brakes, but before he could react, the other two dogs appeared, surrounding the van. They barked viciously, forcing Gary to lock himself inside the vehicle, too scared to move until dawn. Gary wasn't hurt, but his nerves were shot. The next morning, he told anyone who would listen about his encounter. His story was met with gasps of disbelief and concern. But the real shock came when the mayor, in a rare public appearance, announced that the dogs had become a serious threat to the safety of the community. He promised swift action, but deep down, everyone knew that no one had a plan. The dogs were too fast, too unpredictable. Animal control had tried and failed 3 times. The town's usual methods weren't going to cut it this time. What followed was a series of town meetings. The local news ran reports, quoting worried residents who demanded action. Parents were terrified to let their children outside, and some even kept them home from school for days at a time. People began to question how this had all happened. Had the dogs always been here, and no one noticed? Where had they come from, and why were they so aggressive? The town's fear was palpable. Neighbors who used to wave to each other across their yards now avoided eye contact. The park, once the heart of the community, was now a no-go zone. Children who had once played tag and climbed trees there now watched in silence from their windows. They could see the dogs moving in packs, waiting for someone to make a mistake, and it seemed as though the dogs knew it. The more the town locked its doors, the more the dogs roamed, pushing boundaries and taunting the people who used to call the place home. Desperation spread like wildfire. Local businesses suffered as people stayed inside, afraid to run errands or even walk down to the corner store. The usual calm of the town was replaced with an undercurrent of anxiety and frustration. People didn't know who to turn to for help. The strays had become a symbol of everything the town had lost: safety, comfort, and the simple joy of living without fear. And yet, amidst the growing panic, one person, a quiet, observant 9-year-old girl named Mia, refused to give in to the fear. Where the adults saw a problem that could only be solved with force, Mia began to see something entirely different. The adults didn't know what to do with the dogs, but Mia, she knew exactly where to start. While the adults of Elm Ridge scrambled to come up with a solution, Mia remained calm. At just 9 years old, she saw the situation differently than anyone else in town. While the grown-ups spoke of the dogs with disdain and fear, Mia felt something else, a sense of sadness. She had always been an animal lover, and over the years, she had developed a keen sense for understanding their behavior. What troubled Mia more than the dogs' aggression was the way they moved together, always in a pack, always with a sense of purpose. They weren't just wild animals causing trouble. To her, they seemed like survivors, like creatures who had been pushed to the edge, trying to protect themselves in a world that had abandoned them. It was hard to explain to anyone else why Mia felt this way. Her friends were too frightened to listen, and the adults were too busy with their own fears to pay attention to what a child had to say. But Mia had always been a quiet observer. She watched the dogs from her bedroom window, sometimes for hours, noticing the way they would cautiously approach the edges of the town, only to retreat when someone came too close. They were always hungry, always looking for food, but never acting aggressively unless provoked. To Mia, it seemed like they weren't attacking people for no reason. They were merely reacting out of fear. Every day, she saw the same pattern. The dogs would wander through the outskirts of town, avoiding human contact but lingering in the shadows, waiting for food or shelter. She noticed that they never barked without cause, and they would always look back, as if unsure whether to trust the people they encountered. Mia saw the fear in their eyes, and she couldn't understand why no one else seemed to notice. Why couldn't people see that the dogs weren't evil? They were simply scared. Mia wasn't naive. She knew how dangerous a dog could be if it was cornered or threatened, but she also knew that the only way to solve this wasn't through force or violence. The town's attempts to catch the dogs had only made them more elusive, more unpredictable. But what if there was another way? What if, instead of chasing them away, someone tried to reach out to them, to show them that not everyone was a threat? So, one afternoon, when the sun was beginning to set and the streets of Elmridge were still deserted, Mia decided to take matters into her own hands. Armed with a small bag of leftover chicken, a few slices of bread, and her unshakable belief that kindness could break through even the darkest fears, she set out toward the park. She wasn't sure what to expect. The park, once a place of joy, now seemed like a battlefield. The dogs often appeared here, lurking just out of sight. But Mia wasn't afraid. She walked slowly, her heart racing not with fear, but with anticipation. She had a plan. She had something no one else had, a belief that there was goodness in everyone, even in the dogs. As she approached the playground, she saw the black dog first. He was standing just beyond the swings, his dark coat blending with the shadows. The other two were further off near the edge of the trees, watching from a distance. Mia paused for a moment, then gently tossed a few pieces of chicken toward the black dog. He didn't move at first, just stared at her, his sharp eyes gleaming in the fading light. Mia held her breath. Minutes passed. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. Slowly, the dog took a cautious step forward, sniffing the air. The silence stretched out, and just when Mia thought he might turn away, the black dog lowered his head and cautiously picked up the food. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. For the first time since the dogs had arrived, the town saw a glimpse of something different. Mia hadn't forced anything, and she hadn't acted out of fear. She had simply offered kindness, and for the briefest moment, it seemed to be working. The next day, Mia returned to the park with the same small bag of food. She had been thinking about her brief encounter with the black dog all night. The way he had hesitated, then eaten the food from the ground, made her believe that things could be different. Maybe, just maybe, the dogs weren't as hopeless as everyone thought. Maybe they didn't need to be feared or driven out of town. Maybe they just needed a little patience and kindness. As Mia approached the park, her heart fluttered with both excitement and nervousness. The dogs had been seen nearby again. People had started avoiding the area altogether, too afraid to come near the pack. But Mia wasn't scared. She believed that if she stayed calm and kept offering the dogs a chance to trust her, they would eventually let their guard down. When she arrived, she found the black dog waiting by the swings. This time, the sandy-colored one was closer to, resting under the large oak tree that stood at the edge of the park. Mia stood still for a moment, scanning the area. She could see the smallest dog circling in the distance, and she knew that the black dog and the sandy-colored one were the most approachable. Her pulse quickened as she opened the bag, pulling out a piece of chicken. She held it in her hand, but didn't move too quickly. The key was to stay calm, not to startle them. Slowly, Mia sat down on the bench, glancing over at the dogs every few seconds. The black dog was the first to notice her. He tilted his head and stared at her for a long moment. Mia didn't look him in the eye directly. She knew from watching animals that making eye contact could be seen as a challenge. Instead, she looked at the ground, gently placing the piece of chicken in front of her on the bench. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Mia's heart raced, but she stayed still, her hands resting in her lap. The black dog stepped forward, his powerful body moving slowly, cautiously. Mia could hear the sound of his paws brushing against the grass. She didn't move. The black dog paused just in front of her, sniffing the air. The silence was thick, heavy with tension. Would he trust her? Or would he run, like all the others had when people had tried to help before? Then, without warning, the black dog stepped forward, lowering his head to sniff the piece of chicken. He sniffed the air once more, then quickly grabbed the food from the bench. Mia let out a quiet sigh of relief. He hadn't attacked her. Instead, he had taken the food. Slowly, the dog stepped back, chewing the chicken in small, careful bites. Mia couldn't believe it. This was the same dog that had been terrorizing the town just days ago, the same dog that had caused fear to ripple through every street. Yet here he was, taking food from her hand and acting calm for the first time in weeks. Encouraged, Mia slowly reached into the bag for another piece. The sandy-colored dog, who had been watching from the tree, now crept forward too. The little scruffy dog, who had always seemed the most aggressive, was nowhere in sight, but Mia didn't mind. She was focused on the progress she had made with these two. By the time she had fed the black dog and the sandy one, the atmosphere in the park had shifted. The dogs were no longer on edge. They weren't aggressive. They were simply hungry and cautious, much like any animal that had been abandoned or neglected. For the first time since their arrival, they weren't the enemy. They were just animals, doing what they had to in order to survive. Mia smiled, a wave of satisfaction washing over her. She hadn't solved the town's problem yet, but she was starting to see a glimmer of hope. And that, for Mia, was all she needed to keep going. Mia's routine became predictable. Every day, after school, she would walk to the park, carrying a small bag of food. She didn't mind the stares from her classmates when they noticed what she was doing. She was used to being a little different. While others talked about the dangers of the dogs, Mia kept her thoughts to herself. She wasn't trying to convince anyone. She just knew she had to do what she believed was right. The dogs began to recognize her. At first, it was only the black dog and the sandy one that came close, but over time, Mia saw more changes. The little scruffy dog, the one who had barked and lunged at anyone who came near, began to show up too. She wasn't sure when it happened exactly. It was gradual, almost imperceptible. One day, as Mia sat quietly on her usual bench with some chicken in her hand, the scruffy dog appeared from behind a bush. He kept his distance, watching her carefully. Mia didn't try to make a move at first. Instead, she remained seated, her eyes cast down, just as she had done with the others. The dog sniffed the air, then glanced at her before retreating into the trees again. But Mia didn't mind. She knew this was progress. Trust wasn't something that could be forced. It had to be earned. The next day, the scruffy dog came closer, though still hesitant. He stayed a little further back from the other two, but he was there. The moment Mia had been waiting for came a few days later. As she sat on the bench, the scruffy dog approached her, his tail twitching. He stood just out of reach, then cautiously took a few steps closer. His eyes were wary, but there was a curiosity there, something Mia hadn't seen before. With her heart racing in her chest, Mia slowly extended her hand, palm down, toward the dog. She held her breath. The black dog and the sandy dog were already sitting nearby, patiently waiting for their food. The scruffy dog sniffed her hand, but didn't back away. Mia stayed perfectly still, not wanting to startle him. Then, to her astonishment, the scruffy dog took a tentative step forward, his nose brushing her fingers. Mia's heart swelled. It wasn't much, but it was enough. This was the breakthrough she had been hoping for. She gently placed a small piece of chicken on the ground in front of her. The scruffy dog sniffed it, and after a long moment, ate it. Mia smiled, her chest filling with pride. From then on, it became a ritual. Every day, Mia returned to the park, and each day, the dogs came a little closer, a little less fearful. They would wait for her by the swings or under the trees, watching her with wide eyes. When she offered food, they took it gently, never snapping or growling. The dogs were still wary, but they were no longer aggressive. They had started to trust Mia, one meal at a time. As the days passed, Mia noticed a change in the town. The once paralyzing fear was slowly being replaced by curiosity. People began to venture out again, though they still kept a safe distance from the dogs. No one had yet seen the dogs act the way Mia had, but there were whispers. "Did you hear about the little girl and the dogs?" Some said, "She's got them eating right from her hand." Mia wasn't concerned with the gossip. She was just focused on her mission. Each small act of trust from the dogs was a victory, and she knew that if she kept going, something incredible might happen. She wasn't just feeding the dogs anymore. She was feeding hope. Hope for a town that had almost forgotten what it was like to feel safe, and hope for the dogs who had been written off as nothing more than a threat. And for the first time in a long time, Mia felt like she was doing something that mattered. As Mia continued her quiet work in the park, the changes in the dogs became impossible to ignore. The once aggressive pack that had terrorized the town was no longer a threat. They weren't running wild, howling in the streets, or chasing after anyone who dared to step outside. Instead, they were becoming a familiar, if somewhat unorthodox, part of the neighborhood, a reminder that sometimes kindness could break through the hardest of shells. It didn't happen all at once, but gradually, people started to take notice. It started with the local shopkeeper, Mr. Landon, who had watched from his window as Mia fed the dogs day after day. He'd been one of the first to declare that the dogs should be captured and put down, but now he was beginning to wonder, what was Mia doing that no one else had thought of? Why had these dogs stopped being a menace? He couldn't help but marvel at the little girl who seemed to have tamed what had once been feared as the wildest of creatures. Soon, more residents began to stop by the park, watching from a distance as Mia sat with the dogs. They didn't approach at first. They just observed, curious about what was happening. The black dog, the biggest of the three, had started to come even closer. He no longer kept his distance, pacing restlessly, but now sat calmly beside Mia as she fed him, his head lowered in a sign of trust. The sandy-colored dog, too, no longer acted skittish. He would nudge her hand with his nose, eager for the next piece of food, and sometimes, if he was feeling particularly brave, he'd lick her fingers in gratitude. The scruffy dog, who had once been the most suspicious of all, now followed Mia's every movement with something akin to affection in his eyes. The more Mia came to the park, the more the dogs began to see her as a safe presence, and with every day that passed, their behavior shifted. They were no longer just animals trying to survive. They were animals learning to trust, thanks to Mia's patience and consistency. It wasn't long before a small crowd started to gather around the park each afternoon. It was as if word had spread. People from different parts of the town came to see what was going on, and they couldn't believe their eyes. There, in front of them, was the same pack of dogs that had once terrorized the streets, now calmly sitting beside a young girl, taking food from her hand like any ordinary pet. Some of the residents even started to bring their own scraps of food, hoping to join in on this unexpected peace. One afternoon, as Mia sat on her bench, she noticed a few familiar faces watching from the edge of the park. Mrs. Jenkins, the town's elderly librarian, was one of them. Mia had often seen her walking down the street with a basket of bread, her cane tapping rhythmically as she moved. But today she stood frozen, staring at the dogs. "Are those the same dogs?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Mia nodded, not looking up, as she gently petted the black dog's fur. "They're not so bad once you get to know them." The elderly woman stepped closer, eyes wide, as she watched the dogs respond to Mia's touch. She had heard the rumors, the whispers of danger, but seeing it with her own eyes was something different. "They used to scare everyone," Mrs. Jenkins said softly, her voice trembling. "I thought for sure they were a menace." Mia smiled at her, her heart swelling with quiet pride. "They're just scared. They've been through a lot." Mrs. Jenkins stood there for a while, silent, before murmuring, "You've done something extraordinary." Mia's cheeks flushed with modesty, but she said nothing. She didn't need praise. The dog's transformation was all the reward she needed. Yet, as more townspeople began to visit the park, something began to change in the atmosphere of Elmridge. Fear had started to lift, replaced with a sense of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to heal old wounds, even between people and animals. By the end of the week, the park had become a new gathering spot, not for fear, but for curiosity and acceptance. People came not just to watch, but to understand. The town was slowly shifting from a place of suspicion to one of redemption. And it was all because of a brave little girl who believed that kindness, not force, was the key to making things right. It was a warm afternoon when the final turning point came. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over Elmridge as the townspeople continued to gather in the park, watching the three dogs and their unlikely companion, Mia. The park, once avoided by everyone, had become a sanctuary, not just for the dogs, but for the community itself. The fear that had once gripped Elmridge was being replaced by something more powerful: understanding. Mia was sitting on her usual bench, her small feet swinging as she fed the dogs their daily snacks. They were no longer just strays in the eyes of the townspeople. They were becoming part of the fabric of Elmridge, thanks to her quiet, persistent work. The dogs now looked calm, relaxed even, their eyes soft as they sat with Mia, licking her hand or resting their heads on her lap. The people who had once feared them now watched in awe, their skepticism fading. That afternoon, something shifted in the air. As Mia fed the black dog, a figure appeared at the edge of the park. It was Sheriff Collins, the town's ever-diligent lawman. He had been one of the first to voice his concerns about the stray dogs, and he had led the failed attempts to catch them. The townspeople had expected him to swoop in and take action once again, perhaps even to remove the dogs for good. But today, he didn't move toward the pack with a net or a leash. Instead, he paused at the park entrance, watching Mia from a distance, his arms crossed. The dogs were well within reach of him now, but they didn't retreat. They didn't growl or bark like they once had. They were calm, relaxed, and focused on the girl. Mia looked up and noticed him. She gave him a small, friendly wave, not worried at all. Sheriff Collins, however, didn't wave back. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "Mia," he said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "What are you doing here? You're taking quite a risk, you know." Mia didn't hesitate. She looked up at him with a soft smile, a quiet confidence in her eyes. "I'm not taking a risk," she said simply. "I'm showing them that we don't have to be afraid. They just need someone to trust." The sheriff stood still for a moment, staring at the dogs. His mind seemed to be processing the scene before him. The dogs had clearly changed since the last time he'd seen them. They weren't the same fearful, aggressive creatures that had caused chaos. They were different. He had watched from afar as Mia worked with them, but he had never truly understood what was happening. Now, as he observed them, it became clear. "They don't seem dangerous anymore," he said quietly, almost to himself. Mia nodded. "They just needed some help, and now they trust me." Sheriff Collins looked at the little girl, her face shining with an unspoken pride. It was clear that Mia had done something none of the adults could. She hadn't tried to force the dogs into submission. She hadn't treated them as threats. She had simply treated them like living creatures, not something to be feared. She had given them a chance to trust, and they had responded. Mia smiled again, glancing at the dogs. The black dog rested his head on her lap, while the sandy-colored dog sat contentedly at her feet. Even the scruffy one was close by, wagging his tail in a rare show of affection. "You see," Mia said softly, "they're not bad. They just needed someone to understand them." Sheriff Collins remained silent for a few moments, still watching the scene unfold before him. The townspeople had begun to gather behind him, their curiosity piqued. They too had seen the change in the dogs, but it wasn't until now, with the sheriff standing there, openly acknowledging it, that they realized just how much things had shifted. Finally, the sheriff took another step forward, not toward the dogs, but toward Mia. He knelt down beside her, his expression thoughtful. "You've done something remarkable, Mia," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I think it's time we all learn from you. Maybe these dogs aren't the threat we thought they were." For the first time in a long while, there was a shift in the air in Elmridge, not just for the dogs, but for the people. Sheriff Collins had come to a decision, one that would change the course of the town's history. And Mia? Well, she had always known what would happen. She had always believed that kindness, not fear, would win in the end. The next morning, the town of Elmridge felt different. There was a sense of quiet excitement in the air, and for the first time in weeks, people were stepping out of their homes without the weight of fear hanging over them. The dogs, once seen as a menace, had become a symbol of transformation, not just for the animals, but for the town itself. Sheriff Collins, after his conversation with Mia, had decided to take a bold step. He called a town meeting that evening, inviting everyone to the community center. As the room filled with familiar faces, there was a buzz of anticipation. The people who had once feared the dogs now waited to hear what the sheriff would say. When the meeting began, Sheriff Collins stepped to the front, his usual stern demeanor replaced with a calm authority. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze lingering on Mia, who sat in the front row, her eyes wide with hope. "Ladies and gentlemen," the sheriff began, his voice steady, "I've been here long enough to know when something's changed. And something has changed. We've all seen it. The dogs that once terrified this town are no longer the same. They're not acting out of aggression anymore. They've been tamed, not by force, but by the kindness and patience of one person, Mia. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, and several people exchanged glances. The dogs, once feared as a constant threat, were now seen in a new light. It was hard for some to believe, but Sheriff Collins' words carried weight. They had all seen the transformation. Mia's heart raced, but she stayed quiet, waiting for what would come next. Sheriff Collins continued, "I know it hasn't been easy for any of us, but I think it's time we move forward together. It's time to stop seeing these dogs as enemies and start seeing them for what they really are, survivors. And with Mia's help, we're going to make sure they stay safe and respected." The room fell silent for a moment. Then, one by one, hands began to rise. People started speaking up, their voices filled with curiosity and support. Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly librarian, was the first to speak. "I think we all owe Mia an apology," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "She showed us something we couldn't see. I never thought I'd say this, but I believe those dogs deserve a chance. And Mia has proven they're not beyond redemption." One by one, more townspeople spoke. Some offered to help care for the dogs, others suggested setting up a safe space for them in the park, and a few even volunteered to donate food and supplies. The town was beginning to come together, not just in support of the dogs, but in support of a little girl who had brought them all to this point. Later that week, the town worked together to build a small fenced area in the park, a safe space where the dogs could live without fear of being chased or harmed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The dogs now had a home, one where they were loved and cared for, not driven away in fear. The town also set up a regular schedule to bring food and water for them, ensuring that they were never left hungry or in need. Mia continued to visit the dogs every day, but now she wasn't alone. The townspeople came too, eager to see the progress and to spend time with the animals they had once feared. The dogs responded warmly to the attention, no longer retreating into the shadows, but walking up to greet people with wagging tails and curious eyes. Over time, the dogs became a part of the town's identity, a symbol of redemption, patience, and the power of kindness. They were no longer the terror of Elmridge. They were part of the family. People began to refer to them by name. The black dog became Shadow, the sandy one was called Sunny, and the scruffy dog, once the most aggressive, was now Rusty. And as for Mia, she had earned the respect and admiration of everyone in town, but that wasn't what mattered to her. What mattered was that the dogs had found peace, and so had the town. The fear that had once divided them was gone, replaced by a sense of unity. Mia had done something extraordinary. She had shown the people of Elmridge that sometimes the most powerful tool in the world wasn't a weapon, but a little bit of love and a lot of patience. And through her quiet bravery, she had brought her town back together, one dog, one act of kindness at a time.